Imagine waking before dawn, grabbing an axe heavier than a newborn calf, and walking into a forest where trees older than your grandfather towered 200 feet overhead. Your job? Bring them down with nothing but muscle, steel, and split-second timing. One miscalculation, one crack in the wrong direction, and a widow's tree, a massive trunk still caught in the canopy, could swing down like the hammer of God and crush you where you stood. In the peak years of American logging, between 1900 and 1950, death was not an accident. It was a daily gamble. Why did feeding America's lumber mills demand so much blood? And what was it really like for the men who stepped into the cathedral of giants, knowing that every tree could be their last? To understand, you have to walk into the woods. The Pacific Northwest, the Great Lakes, the Appalachian Ridges. These were America's timber empires. Forests stretched for miles, dense with Douglas fir, white pine, and redwood so massive it took a week for 2 men to fell a single tree. Logging camps appeared overnight, clusters of rough-hewn cabins and canvas tents perched on hillsides or tucked into river valleys. There was no electricity, no running water, just kerosene lamps and wood stoves. The camps reeked of sweat, wet wool, and pine sap, a permanent fog of wood smoke clinging to everything. Men slept in bunkhouses packed so tight you could hear your neighbor's dreams. Lice and bedbugs were constant companions, and fistfights over blankets or the best spot near the stove were routine. But none of that mattered once the sun came up. Because out there, in the timber, the real battle began. Before we continue with the story, if you believe these men deserve to be remembered, that their sacrifice built the world we live in today, hit that subscribe button, but only if you truly mean it. Also, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It's fascinating to see how far these forgotten histories reach. A logger's day started in pitch darkness. By 5 a.m., men were already sharpening axes and 2-man cross-cut saws, testing the bite of each tooth against a thumbnail. Breakfast was industrial. Flapjacks, salt pork, black coffee, strong enough to strip paint. No one spoke much. You ate fast and you ate heavy, because once you entered the forest, there would be no breaks until the dinner bell rang, 12 hours later. The first light of dawn filtered through the canopy as crews fanned out, each team assigned a section of virgin timber. The forest floor was a maze of roots, fallen logs, and undergrowth thick enough to hide a bear. Above, the trees formed a living ceiling, branches interlocking 150 feet overhead, blocking out the sky. The air was cool and damp, thick with the scent of moss and rot. And somewhere in that silence, the work began. The fallers were the elite, chosen not for their size but for their precision. These men wielded double-bitted axes and cross-cut saws longer than a man is tall. Their job was to read a tree, judge its lean, measure the wind, calculate the weight distribution, and then bring it down exactly where it needed to fall. A miscalculation could send a tree crashing through the crew, snapping lesser trunks like matchsticks, or worse, turning into a barber chair. That's when a tree splits vertically under its own weight, the trunk exploding upward in jagged splinters that could impale a man before he even knew what hit him. Fallers worked in pairs, one on each end of the saw, pulling in rhythm, back and forth, the blade biting deeper with every stroke. The saw sang, a metallic rasp that echoed through the forest, mixing with the grunts of exhausted men and the occasional crack of splintering wood. Hours could pass on a single cut, sweat soaked through flannel shirts even in freezing weather. Arms burned, shoulders screamed. But you didn't stop. Stopping meant the saw would bind, trapping the blade in the cut, and freeing it could take hours. So, you pulled, and you trusted your partner to match your rhythm, stroke for stroke, until the tree began to groan. That groan was everything. It meant the tree was ready to fall, but it also meant the window for escape was closing. Fallers learned to listen, to feel the shift in weight as the tree began its descent. They'd shout, "Timber," and sprint, boots scrambling over roots and debris, lungs burning as they put distance between themselves and tons of falling wood. The sound of a tree hitting the ground was like thunder, a concussive boom that shook the earth and sent birds scattering for miles. But sometimes the tree didn't fall clean. Sometimes it hung up in the canopy, caught on neighboring branches, suspended at a deadly angle. These were widowmakers, and they killed more loggers than any other hazard in the woods. A widowmaker could hang for hours or days, swaying in the wind, creaking with every gust. Eventually, someone had to bring it down. The job fell to the bravest or most desperate, men who would climb neighboring trees with axes and pry poles, trying to dislodge the hung-up trunk. One wrong move, a branch snapping, a rope slipping, and the tree would come down like a guillotine, catching the climber in its path. There were no ropes thick enough to hold a falling redwood, no harnesses strong enough to save a man if the tree decided to fall. You climbed, you worked, and you prayed. And if the tree came down on you, well, the camp boss would write a letter to your wife, and the crew would move on. Once a tree was down, the real labor began. Buckers sawed the massive trunks into manageable logs, working on their knees in sawdust and wood chips. The crosscut saw, screaming as it bit through heartwood. Each log could weigh several tons, and moving them required brute force and clever engineering. Enter the skidders. These men attached chains and cables to logs, hitching them to teams of oxen or draft horses. The animals strained against the weight, hooves churning mud and snow as they dragged logs down mountain slopes and through creek beds. Skidding was chaos. Logs rolled unpredictably, chains snapped under tension, and horses panicked when a log shifted and pinned them. Men were crushed between logs and trees or trampled by spooked animals. A snapped cable could whip back with enough force to decapitate a man, and it happened often enough that skidders learned to stand clear whenever tension built in the line. But speed was everything. The faster you moved timber, the more you got paid, so caution took a back seat to quota. By the 1920s, logging railroads began snaking through the forests, replacing animal power with steam engines. Narrow-gauge tracks were laid hastily, often on slopes so steep that trains could barely grip the rails. Logs were loaded onto flat cars using steam donkeys, massive winches powered by boilers, and hauled to the nearest mill. The railroads brought speed, but they also brought new dangers. Loaders worked beneath swinging logs suspended by cables, guiding tons of wood onto moving trains. A cable failure meant instant death. Train derailments were common, especially on icy or rain-slicked tracks, sending logs and workers tumbling down hillsides. And the steam donkeys themselves were temperamental beasts. Boilers exploded without warning, scalding men with superheated steam or shredding them with shrapnel. Maintenance was minimal, inspections non-existent. If a machine worked, you used it until it killed someone. Then you replaced the man, not the machine. The logging camps were their own kind of prison. Most were owned by timber companies that controlled every aspect of a logger's life. You lived in company housing, ate company food, and bought supplies from the company store at inflated prices. Wages were paid in scrip, company-issued currency that could only be spent at the company store, trapping men in a cycle of debt. A logger might work all season and still owe money by the time he left, and leaving wasn't easy. Camps were often miles from the nearest town, accessible only by logging road or river. In winter, you were snowed in. In spring, the roads became impassable mud. You worked, you slept, you worked again. There was no escape. The men who filled these camps came from everywhere and nowhere. Scandinavian immigrants, Swedes, Norwegians, Finns, dominated the Great Lakes timber regions, their names filling camp rosters and union roles. In the Pacific Northwest, Japanese and Chinese laborers worked alongside poor whites from Appalachia, each group segregated into separate bunkhouses, but united by shared misery. French Canadians drifted south from Quebec, and drifters, ex-convicts, and men running from debt or the law found refuge in the anonymity of the timber camps. No one asked questions. If you could swing an axe and didn't mind the risk, you had a job. But the danger wasn't just physical. The isolation, the relentless labor, and the constant proximity to death wore men down. Alcoholism was rampant. On paydays, entire crews would descend on the nearest town, blowing weeks of wages on whiskey and card games before stumbling back to camp broke and hungover. Fights were common, sometimes deadly. Men carried knives and grudges, and disputes over cheating at cards or stolen boots could end with a body dumped in the river. Camp bosses rarely intervened unless it affected production. A dead logger was a problem only if it slowed the cut. The companies kept records, but not the kind you'd hope for. Ledgers tracked board feet and profit margins, not lives lost. When a man died, the camp boss might note it in a logbook. Swedish faller, crushed by widowmaker, age unknown. And that was the end of it. There were no investigations, no inquiries, no compensation for families. If a man had kin, someone might write a letter. More often, the body was buried in a shallow grave near the camp, marked with a wooden cross that would rot away within a few years. Some companies carried insurance, but the policies were designed to protect the company, not the workers. A death might cost $500 in settlement, far less than the profit from a week's worth of timber. Labor organizers tried to change things. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, made logging camps a battleground in the 1910s and 20s, demanding 8-hour days, safer conditions, and real wages instead of scrip. The companies fought back with hired thugs, blacklists, and mass firings. Strikes turned violent. In Everett, Washington, in 1916, a confrontation between strikers and company guards left 7 dead and dozens wounded. The Wobblies won some battles. Shorter days, better food, the end of scrip in some camps. But the work itself remained brutal. You couldn't organize away the laws of physics. A falling tree didn't care about union membership. Then came the accidents that made headlines. On March 10, 1924, a logging train derailed near Arctique, Tacoma, Washington, sending 14 flat cars loaded with old-growth fir tumbling into a ravine. 11 loggers died, crushed beneath the logs they'd spent weeks cutting. The company blamed faulty brakes, but investigators found that the train had been overloaded and the engineer pressured to run faster than safe. No one was prosecuted. The timber barons had too much power, too much money, and too many politicians in their pockets. The families of the dead received $200 each, and the mill kept running. Then there was the explosion at a sawmill in Oregon in 1927, where a boiler blew apart, killing 8 workers and injuring 20 more. The boiler had been flagged for replacement 2 years earlier, but the cost of a new one was deemed too high. After the explosion, the company paid out settlements and installed a new boiler. Business resumed within a week. These weren't isolated tragedies. They were symptoms of an industry that valued timber over humanity, where the bottom line always trumped the body count. Yet, even in this chaos, there were moments of defiance. Some camps developed reputations for safety, run by bosses who'd worked the timber themselves and refused to send men into situations they wouldn't face. These camps were rare, but they proved that logging didn't have to be a death sentence. Slower cuts, better equipment maintenance, and respect for the crew could reduce fatalities without killing profits. but most companies ignored the lesson. Why spend money on safety when workers were cheap and plentiful? The tide began to turn in the 1930s. The Great Depression forced the federal government to intervene in industries it had long ignored. New Deal programs brought inspectors into the camps, mandating basic safety standards. Hard hats, first aid stations, rules against overloaded trains. The changes were modest, but they mattered. Fatality rates began to drop. Slowly at first, then more sharply as mechanization replaced the most dangerous jobs. Chainsaws, introduced in the 1940s, eliminated the need for two-man crosscut saws. Trucks replaced logging railroads, and hydraulic loaders ended the deadly practice of hand-loading logs onto flat cars. By 1950, the old-growth forests were largely gone, and with them, the camps that had defined an era. Logging remained dangerous, it still is today. But the scale of loss had changed. The men who survived carried scars, both visible and hidden, and their stories became the stuff of legend. They'd walked into the Cathedral of Giants and emerged, if they were lucky, with their lives. The forests they felled built a nation. Homes, bridges, factories, entire cities. But the price was written in unmarked graves and forgotten names. Today, when you see a wooden beam in an old house or a weathered boardwalk along a waterfront, remember where it came from. Remember the men who brought it out of the forest, who gambled their lives for a day's pay, who knew that every swing of the axe could be their last. The trees are gone, but their legacy remains, built on blood, sweat, and the kind of courage that comes from having no other choice. What do you think? Was the cost worth it, or could we have done better? Share your thoughts below.